Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome to another 1/400 scale diecast model aircraft review of this, the Boeing 747 SP, rendered in 1/400 scale by NG, Next Generation Models. The 747 SP, it is one of the more unusual civil jets ever produced, not only by the Boeing company, but in the whole history of civil aviation. It is a Boeing 747, and it is based on the 747-100. That is the first variant of the 747 to go into commercial service. However, you'll notice here, it is rather short and stumpy. Now, why is this? SP in the moniker 747 SP, that stands for Special Performance. And what was that special performance, pray tell? Well, that special performance goes into extending the range of the 747. In particular, and we'll get into this later on, there was one very prominent American carrier who needed to extend the range of their jets in order to do long-haul flights across the oceans and across the continents. Therefore, Boeing took the 747-100, which was already by this point a very successful civil jet, and it stands as one of the most successful civil jets of all time, and of course the 747 remains flying today in 2020 in the Dash 8 variants, but they needed to extend the range of this thing. And other companies, other manufacturers were doing this too, but they went a different engineering route that we'll talk about later on. The SP, though, it remains the only example of an already in-place commercial airliner that got chopped up a little bit, had a different empennage fitted, had different wings fitted, and then was sent back out basically as is, and then it immediately found success. Not necessarily sales success, as we'll also get into, but the SP remains a wonderful testament to improvisation in terms of engineering, dealing with parts and materials and know-how that is already in existence and already on hand at a production facility, and modifying it just a little bit in order to make this aircraft, originally conceived as something a bit different, do things that it was never designed to do in the first place, and then hitting an absolute home run in the process. NG here in 1/400 scale bring the 747 SP to us in this September 2020 release. We'll take a closer look at this model, show you all the little details of it, and talk a little bit more of the history of the Boeing 747 SP. As always with these videos, before we take a closer look at the model, let's take a look at the box from whence it came. Coming in from screen right, here we go, the box for the 747 SP by NG. Now, this is a bit of a different sort of box from what we get on the Gemini Jets models, mostly because we don't have that look inside tab with a little write-up about the aircraft. But we do have our front cover art here, Boeing 747 SP, both items there trademarked by Boeing. There is our cover art, computer rendering of the model there, with gear retracted, about the same size as the model itself, and very nice box cover art that we see here. I do appreciate the NG boxes. What they lack in terms of product descriptions, they often make up for, at least somewhat, in that cover art. And you can see there that the cover art on this box definitely is trying to imitate the livery of the aircraft in the Las Vegas Sands Corporation livery there. There we go. NG, Next Generation Model, 1/400 scale die-cast model aircraft there. 1/400 scale collectible models die-cast metal. Cool. Registration on the aircraft, Victor Papa Bravo Lima Kilo. There we go. And then in very small print down here, just barely readable perhaps, Boeing officially licensed product, produced under license from Boeing, Boeing 747, and the associated distinctive logos, product marking, and trade dress are trademarks of the Boeing company. There you go. Bottom panel of the box, Boeing 747 SP, NG Next Generation Model. Another rendering of the aircraft with our registration reiterated. Side panel, there we go. Boeing 747 SP, NG, Las Vegas Sands Corporation. And there we go, 1/400 scale collectible models, die-cast metal. The back of the box, there we go. Another rendering of the aircraft, effectively the same as the front of the box. And then we've got our social media and corporate website links there for NG. Item number is 07001. And then, of course, our Boeing trademark stuff there. And then our choking hazard small parts for the adult collector, not suitable for children under 14 years old, ages 14 plus. And then I'm assuming that the Chinese script here says basically the same thing as the English does, but there it is for the box. No look inside tab or anything like that. Very much unlike the Gemini Jets boxes, there's no look inside tab, and there's no write-up about the aircraft, which means that the box doesn't really tell you all that much about the model's subject matter. But that's okay, because we have technology. We're able to do that for ourselves, and we shall do that presently. The Boeing 747 SP. What is this airplane? Well, the 747 from Boeing is arguably the most successful airliner ever built. First flying at the end of the 1960s, the 747, when it was introduced, was the largest passenger aircraft ever constructed, and even today it remains the second largest commercial airliner ever to fly in active service. Now, of course, the 747 has changed quite a bit since its introduction as the 747-100. However, this is really a very odd addition in the 747 family tree. The 747 SP is not really considered to be an evolution of the 747. Rather, it's kind of, you could say it's a fraternal twin of the 747-100 series, because it wasn't necessarily designed to be the biggest or the most capable of the 747 lineup. It wasn't really deemed as an improvement on the original design. Rather, it was conceived as a variant thereof, designed from the ground up to do something different from its bigger fraternal twin brother, but still a very capable aircraft in its own right. The origin of the 747 SP really comes from the early 1970s with the advent of the tri-jet airliners. That would be the McDonnell DC-10 and the Lockheed L-1011. Now, the tri-jet regulations, they came about because of ETOPS rule, saying that you couldn't fly across the Atlantic on less than 3 engines. So in other words, because of the possibility of engine failures in this era, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s really, the airliners needed to have at least 3 engines in order to fly directly across the oceans. Otherwise, they would have had to fly over land as much as possible, which would have really added a lot of distance and therefore a lot of time to a transatlantic crossing. This meant that most airliners followed a quad-jet scheme for flying transatlantic or trans-Pacific, if the case may warrant that. However, quad jets are more expensive to operate. The more engines you have, the more fuel you burn per hour, which means the more fuel you gotta put on board, which means the more money it costs. So, if you could get away with having fewer engines, in this case 3, then you can skirt those regulations, still meet the requirements in terms of getting across the oceans on the minimum number of engines, and you can fly a direct route. So all in all, it's cheaper for everybody involved. The DC-10 and the L-1011 took the tri-jet scheme, and they were both reasonably successful airliners. The L-1011, though, not quite having as long of a production life as perhaps it should have had, and certainly, though, it absolutely gained a lot of fans, and a couple of them still remain in service today. The DC-10, though, mostly phased out, but variants thereof, such as the MD-11 and freight configurations, are still actively flying in cargo operations. The 747 SP, though, well, it's a quad jet, quite obviously. However, believe it or not, it was originally conceived as a tri-jet. You notice that very large vertical stabilizer in the tail section of the fuselage. That's not only there for aerodynamic purposes, and it was necessary to have that larger vertical stabilizer because having a shorter fuselage relative to the standard 747, this meant that the aircraft could have a much larger yaw moment, which meant that you needed a larger vertical stabilizer to counter that yaw. But originally, they were going to follow a third engine placement in the tail, much like the Lockheed L-1011. There's going to be an S-duct to feed that engine, and then ultimately to have it exhaust out the back of the aircraft where the auxiliary power unit sits on this aircraft as it eventually came to fruition. That design was scrapped, but the big tail fin remained, so it's one of the distinctive features of ultimately what became the 747 SP. However, in order to meet that demand, to fly across the oceans, increase the aircraft's range, but also increase the economy, they made the 747 shorter, all around smaller, But in so doing and maintaining the same four-engine quad-jet scheme, they were able drastically to increase the range of the 747-100 as it was at the time. And Pan American World Airways, who were the ones who requested Boeing to build this aircraft, they absolutely were the immediate beneficiaries thereof. 747SP, in terms of its production characteristics, what is it? It's a wide-body jet airliner, quad jet, as we can see here, manufactured by Boeing. The aircraft made its first flight on July 4th, 1975, and it was introduced into service in 1976 with Pan Am, who were the launch customer for the aircraft. The primary users for the aircraft were Pan Am, South African Airways, Iran Air, China Airlines, and the Royal Flight of Oman, as well as the Royal Flight of the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia flies one of these aircraft as well. However, most of the 747 SPs have left public service today. This aircraft here in the livery of the Las Vegas Sands Corporation, a private charter company, they still fly one of their 747 SPs. They also have an L-1011 that I think is in mothballs, but still in their colors. They've got a few other aircraft as well that they do fly from time to time. So this aircraft is still flying today with Las Vegas Sands. There is also a couple of them flying with the governments of Oman, as well as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. There is one further 747 SP that flies with NASA in their Sophia Observatory program. And basically what they did with that aircraft was they took the 747 SP, they hollowed out the rear tail cone section, and on the port side of the fuselage there is an openable hatch that can open in flight, and that exposes the primary mirror of a telescope, an optical telescope, that is then able to take images of the heavens from 30,000 feet or so. So just like the same rationale of putting an observatory on top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, or putting an observatory in low Earth orbit, as the case of the Hubble Space Telescope or the Chandra X-ray Observatory, the higher you go, the less atmosphere you have to obscure your view and cause distortions with refractions and things with atmospheric turbulence, meaning you can get better optical data for your astronomical observations. So one of these aircraft still flying with NASA as an airborne observatory, got a couple of them flying for the royal families of some very oil-moneyed countries, and you've got one further flying here in the Las Vegas Sands livery for the Las Vegas Sands Corporation. That's basically the skinny on what the 747 SP is. Now, the nuts and bolts in terms of what this thing is. 747 SP, this was an aircraft designed in the early 1970s, again, before a lot of computerized avionics systems came into the cockpit commonly, so we have a crew of 3 required to operate the aircraft. We have 2 pilots and a flight engineer. We have an exit limit of 400 on this thing. So the 747-100 having a maximum occupancy of around 450, 500, something like that. Little bit of a reduction in overall passenger capacity here, but exit limit is still 400. Overall length of this aircraft is 184 feet 9 inches with a wingspan of 195 feet 8 inches. Total wing area 5,500 square feet. And the overall height from the bottom of the main gear to the top of the vertical stabilizer is 66 feet 10 inches, or 65 feet 10 inches, rather, -1 from my figure there. The operating empty weight ranges between 325,260 pounds to 336,870 pounds, with a maximum takeoff weight of 696,000 pounds, with a maximum landing weight, therefore, 450,000 pounds. The engine models that were available on the 747 SP were exactly the same as the engines that could be fitted to the standard 747-100. Those are namely the Pratt & Whitney JT9D-7s or the Rolls-Royce RB211s. Those were the same engines that you got with the L-1011 TriStar from Lockheed. Overall thrust characteristics from those engines, if you had the Pratt & Whitneys on board, you got anywhere between 46,000 and 50,000 pound-feet of thrust at sea level, or if you went for the Rolls-Royce engines, you got 49,000 to 52,000 thereabout pound-feet of thrust at sea level. This gave the aircraft a maximum speed of Mach 0.92, or 542 knots, that's 1,004 kilometers per hour, so true transonic flight there. However, the cruising speed was Mach 0.86, that's 493 knots, or 914 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling on the 747 SP, pretty high, 45,100 feet. That's also one of the reasons why NASA must have chosen it to house their Sophia Observatory. very high, whole lot less air up there, whole lot less atmospheric distortion is going to cause a problem. Maximum range, and this was really why Pan Am needed this aircraft. Maximum range was 6,650 nautical miles. That is 12,320 kilometers, or 7,650 statute miles. Maximum fuel capacity was 50,360 US gallons. That is 190,630 liters. The range of this aircraft was really its calling card, and it was really why this aircraft was built in the first place. Pan Am needed a plane that could fly long-haul, non-stop flights. In particular, they needed an aircraft that could service their longest scheduled route between New York City and Tehran. Tehran, Iran. Yes, that's a long, non-stop flight. So Pan Am needed an aircraft that could do this. The L-1011, they flew L-1011s, but they didn't put the L-1011 on that route. The DC-10 couldn't have done it, but the 747 SP, this aircraft, could do it with that maximum range there of, again, 6,650 nautical miles. That's 12,300 kilometers, give or take. That's a lot of distance for a non-stop flight. Of course, we've got aircraft now with ranges in excess of 8,000 nautical miles, so it doesn't sound like all that much today, but in 1975, 1976, when this aircraft was entering service, that was the longest range airliner ever produced up to that point, and it was the longest range airliner produced up until 1989, when Boeing launched the 747-400, which remained the gold standard for the 747 until the introduction of the Dash 8 in the early 2010s. So yeah, this was very much an adaptation of pre-existing technology, but they did it in such a way that would allow basically the already very capable 747-100 to almost double its range. It's really amazing what they were able to do without really adapting the technology. Rather, they were playing with what they already had and just tweaking it a little bit into a slightly different form factor to allow it to do things that the original variant just could not do. Really remarkable. Obviously, you had to make concessions in terms of overall passenger capacity, but with those little aerodynamic tweaks there, changing the disposition of the vertical stabilizer, changing the wing design a bit, going for single element trailing edge flaps rather than the triple slotted flaps that the standard 747 used, but other than that, basically allowing the plane to be as is in terms of development relative to the Dash 100, you got a lot of additional capacity for not all that much additional work. So hats off to Boeing for being resourceful with what they had on hand, and of course, it definitely worked out for them. Now, of course, the 747 SP did not sell all that well. Boeing needed roughly 40 of these to sell in terms for the program to break even, and between 1976 and 1989, the aircraft was produced to the tune of 45. So the SP program just barely broke even. 45 aircraft were produced, and, not bad. Not bad at all. Today, I think we see the SP as being a little bit of an oddity in the world of civil aviation just because it's a little bit of a stumpy 747, but it is very respectable in its own right as an independent aircraft, and not just seen as a variant of the 747-100, which it really is if you really want to be nuts and bolts technical about it. But really, it deserves respect in its own right as an entity unto itself. As the aircraft continues to rotate before us, we can start to take a look at some of the finer details on this absolutely wonderful September 2020 release from NG. I have not featured all that many NG models on the channel. In fact, this is only technically the third, but really the second that I have ever featured on the channel, because the last time we took a look at an NG model, it was two L-1011 TriStars, and they were wonderfully produced, and this 747 SP, basically being brand new to the world in September, absolutely fits in with the overall standard of production quality that we came to expect from looking at the L-1011s. And the L-1011s for a time were the only NG models that I had in the collection, but they were absolutely wonderfully done, and now I've got to say that the 747 SP has been absolutely no disappointment on that front either. It's wonderfully produced once I saw that MG was going to be making a 747 SP, I absolutely had to get it. And once they went out for pre-order, I put my pre-order in, and eventually it came in. And I've got to say, no disappointment at all. Everything about this looks wonderfully done. The graphics are good. The overall proportions and assembly quality are good. It is all die-cast metal, with the exception of the engine nacelles and the landing gear. The landing gear are really nice. They are done in plastic and plastic wheels with rubber tires over them. Really, it looks tremendous, and I could not be more satisfied with what I see here on this 747 SP. It's also a pretty weighty model. Again, the fuselage and the wings are all die-cast, so there is some good mass to this thing, but honestly, it looks really, really good. Very good detail on the fuselage. You can see the wing details on the upper and lower decks, the cockpit windows there, some air data ports, some upper deck hatches, as well as the emergency escape hatch over the cockpit. That's visible. The leading edges of the wings look good. The engines and the engine nacelles, they look good. We'll see a little bit later the fan blade detail there in the outer stage of the engine before we lead down into the compressors. There's the outlet for the APU and the tail cone. Everything just looks really, really good on this model, and I am quite pleased with it once again. Stopping our rotation, and we can start to take a closer look at the forward section of the aircraft, starting with our nose and cockpit area. Getting in a bit closer, as close as we dare, before we start to lose our focus. You can see just generally the disposition of everything. Looks absolutely great. Obviously, we've got our nose landing gear down there. The tires on all of the gear, the mains and the nose gear, they are perfectly circular. There are no flat spots or weird bulges in the tire, and it's all done in rubber once again. So that looks absolutely tremendous. Very pleased with all of that. And then moving up, you have got the cheat line separating the white from the blue sections of fuselage, punctuated with some blue stripes and a gold stripe just underneath the cabin windows there. Looks really, really nice. I do like that blue paint. It shows up pretty nice. I think the camera is making that blue look a little bit brighter than it actually is by eye. It is a very deep royal blue, not quite a navy blue, but it's a deep royal blue, and if you've seen any pictures of this aircraft in reality, in the Las Vegas Sands livery, you know exactly what it looks like, but it looks good on the model as a physical object. Again, the camera probably giving us a little bit of distortion there. Moving up toward the nose cone, you can see there is a shut line between the nose cone and the rest of the fuselage. That's housing radar equipment, quite obviously. And then moving up further, you have our cockpit windows there. Looks good. We have got windscreen wipers modeled just underneath the cockpit windows there. That looks good. And then, of course, we do have a little bit of an emergency egress hatch over the top, and then we have an upper level hatch visible right there if we had a jetway connected to the upper deck on the aircraft. We have got our exit doors here. We have got our L1 and L2 door heading toward the wing root, and then if we move rearward, you can see the L3 and L4 doors. There are 4 exit doors per side on the 747 SP, and they are all rendered nicely here. I will say something about the graphics on this model, though. I'm not 100% sure how NG are doing their graphics these days, because they're very good, don't get me wrong, but if you do just run your finger across the side of the aircraft, you can feel that there is a texture difference between the printed and non-printed areas of the fuselage in terms of the stripes, the windows, the doors, all things like that. I don't know if this is tempo printing and they've just been very, shall we say, liberal with their use of ink. I mean, everything looks super sharp here, so it's not like they've overpainted or anything, or if this is actually a water slide decal situation. And it'll be interesting to see how this model ages, because I can feel a texture difference between the areas on the aircraft that have details versus those that are just paint. So, I don't know. I've never felt that on a Gemini Jets model. All of the details feel flush to the touch, no matter which area of the aircraft you're feeling. If it's the fuselage, whether it's just painted or it has graphics on it, that's because Gemini Jets, they use tampo printing. Not 100% sure if NG have done something different here, but I did just want to note that there is a texture difference there between just the bare paint and the actual graphic detail areas on the fuselage. But the quality of the graphics is really good. Nothing's crooked, nothing's smudged. Everything is legible in the case of where we do have text, such as the registration toward the tail section of the aircraft. That's all perfectly legible. And of course, all the other detail is easily discerned. Moving toward midships, we can see a couple of details here. First, over the top of the aircraft, we have got the distinctive hump of the 747. That's basically carried over directly from the 100 variant of the 747. It looks to be about the same length. Of course, it is longer in proportion to the rest of the fuselage, but the hump section itself looks about the same as it would be on the Dash 100. We've also got ourselves a little antenna on the top section of the hump there. That looks good. It's straight. It's sitting there true. It is not loose or anything like that, so that's good. We also do have a couple of belly antennas here on the aircraft, one in the forward section that we can see just there. Brilliant. Wing root and wing spar area. We do have right here the wing spar and then the wing root coming into the fuselage. This is not a cradle arrangement. The wings are stuck into the fuselage on the model, and they're secured nicely. It looks really good. Obviously, we've got our main landing gear down there as well. Again, just as the nose gear, very stout, very correct in terms of the overall size and shape of everything versus the scale requirements. Looks good. And of course, all the gears, the nose gear and the main gear, they do roll. They do not pivot though, but they do roll, and they roll very freely. Moving across the leading edge of the wing, you can see that we do have some landing light detail here. Again, this is just printed on, no bezels or anything like that, but it is there. And then moving across the leading edge of the wing, we have got our engine nacelles, and of course moving toward the wing tip with our red strobe to show that this is in fact the port side wing. Toward the rear of the aircraft, there we go. You can see our registration is there. Victor Papa Bravo Lima Kilo, if you can see that, just barely in focus. There we go. And then moving up now toward the empennage section of the aircraft. That looks real good. Just slowly bringing the camera up. There we go. And that very large vertical stabilizer in comparison to the Dash 100 variant of the 747. Two more topside antennas here. We have a little bit of a dish antenna right here. Obviously, you remember, this is a privately operated aircraft, so I'm sure that antenna was retrofitted later on for whatever television or other communications capabilities that are needed by the users. And then, of course, we have one more antenna. This one does look like it could have been original to the aircraft. There is the vertical stabilizer. You can see it has a little bit of a fairing here as it joins up to the top side of the fuselage. And you can also see the difference in shape of this part of the tail cone versus the traditional 747 variants, because obviously we have some different aerodynamic configurations and different aerodynamic constraints that this aircraft is going to introduce here, because it is shorter than the standard 747 by quite a bit. So we needed to make some small tweaks to the tail cone area just to make sure that there is still sufficient space for the auxiliary power unit, as well as ensuring flow integrity to our horizontal stabilizers back there. So empennage looks a bit different than it does on the standard 747-100, but still, all in all, looks very, very good and obviously very functional. It provided all of the aerodynamic stability and control authority that was needed in order to make this aircraft work, and work well, it certainly did. Take a look at the nose of the 747 SP. There we go, zooming in on it. There is some of that detail that we discussed earlier. You can see there we have got our radar dome nose tip right there. You can even see some of the detailing there with regard to the shut lines between the fairing from the nose tip and the rest of the fuselage structure. That looks good. And of course, we have got our cabin windows wrapping around the nose structure there in the very unique layout of the 747 in general. Some of the seats there in first class, at least in airliner configuration, are actually ahead of the cockpit. So probably one of very few aircraft, at least civil jets, where passengers theoretically could be sitting ahead of the cockpit. Real interesting there. Obviously, the cockpit is on the upper deck, though. Moving outboard, we have got ourselves the wings as well as our engines and our engine nacelles. They look good. You can see the fan blade detail in both of our starboard engines there. That looks really good. I like all of that. And then, of course, on the port wing with our port engines, that all looks complementary as you would expect. Set our depth of focus for the engine intake specifically, and you can see all of that. Very nice, nothing smudged around in there, just looks marvelous. And then of course you can see the aircraft sits straight and level on the gear, no roll dialed in on the ground, and it is not pitched in any weird way. It just sits straight and level. The gear take up the weight of the model nicely, and again, they all do roll quite nicely as well. So no real complaints in my book in terms of what it looks like here on the ground, and of course, when we see it later on in the outro, we'll see it on the stand as well as the Gemini Jet stand, but the NG models do fit on it pretty well, so that's good. Set our depth of focus for the vertical stabilizer there at the tail. You can see the leading edges and all of that there. Looks absolutely fine, no problems. And then of course our horizontal stabilizers as well. That all looks good. And you can see maybe just a little bit of the shut line disposition there for our elevator control surfaces, but that all looks well and good to me. No problems with any of that. Absolutely marvelous. Taking a look at 747 SP from the starboard side now. Zoom in as close as we dare within the constraints of focus. And there we go. Starboard side, forward, you can see we've got our R1 and R2 doors now. Very similar details to what we saw from the 3/4 port side view, but there it is once again. We do have a hatch up here on the upper deck just behind the cockpit, and then of course our proper R1, R2 doors here forward of the wing root. That looks good. Our belly antenna visible there. And then of course we start to get to our starboard wing. Very nice. You can see the engines there. The nacelles nicely detailed for what they are. Not all that much to see on the nacelles, but for what they are you can see them. Obviously the intake and then compressor stages of the engines. You can see the overall disposition of the pylons that the nacelles are mounted to, supporting the weight of the engines there. And then of course all the thrust generated by the engines imparted into the aircraft via those pylons. So they have to be pretty strong bits of kit. And then of course the tail cone area for the engine exhaust there. Very cool. Here is the green strobe on the starboard wing tip. That looks good. And speaking of wing tips, you can see that we do have this little probe coming off of the wing tips there. That is, I think, part of either an antenna array or it's actually an electrostatic discharge point. We've seen this on a couple other aircraft. We saw this on the E4B, which is a 747-200, really. We also saw this on the KC-135, which is a Boeing 707. We did not see this on newer aircraft. We didn't see this on newer variants of the 747, such as the 400 or the Dash 8, but we do see it here on the SP, and it's interesting. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of that little pylon coming off the wingtip is, but I would assume it has something either to do with functioning as an antenna or for electrostatic discharge. But again, I can look into that a bit more. Regardless, coming back up, we can see here that we have got ourselves our empennage disposition. There is our registration tail number there. Victor Papa Bravo Lima Kilo. And then moving up to the top of our vertical stabilizer visible right there. Looks good. Looks real good. I like all of that. And again, it's a pretty distinctive feature on this aircraft, but it looks good. Additionally, you can see the shut line there for the control surface associated with the rudder. That all looks fine, and obviously with the reflection there, you can see the overall finish of that surface. It looks good. The reflection is crisp and clear, distorted only where the shut lines are, so that's completely within our limits in terms of what we'd expect to see. And then, of course, we have got our horizontal stabilizers coming off here. You can see the area where the whole stabilizer could pivot fore and aft for trim. And then, of course, we have got our wingtip areas there on the horizontal stabilizer. It looks good, looks real good. There's our R4 door and our R3 door moving back forward. Looks good. Registration looks absolutely marvelous. I really do like this one. I do like the overall proportion of the SP despite it being a little bit odd at first glance. It really is a very interesting looking aircraft. Looking at the SP from the rear, zooming in on there. There we go. First of all, in the tail cone, you can see where we have got our outlet, our exhaust outlet for the auxiliary power unit. It is right there, and you can see that they have rendered it, NG have rendered it, not only in the correct location, but it looks to be about the right size, and it is actually a different piece of hardware that's not printed or painted on. That is an actual piece of hardware that you can feel in 3 dimensions if you do touch it there. So, looks good, and again, that's in the correct place, and as far as our scale correctness goes, looks about right. If we move down a bit, you can see that we have our landing gear from the rear, plainly visible there. Looks good. Get our focus set for the main gear. There we go. Our inboard gear and our outboard gear looks pretty straight. I see no problems with that. The height looks about the same. All the struts look straight. The open landing gear doors look good with no distortion or weird bends in the metal or plastic. No problems. And then the exhaust sides of our engines. Here on the port wing, we can see that. You can see, if we bring the camera up a little bit, start to see some of the shut lines for the aerodynamic control surfaces on the upper face of the wing. It might be a little bit washed out with the white on white, but you can see some of the shut lines there, the trailing edge of the wing. Looks pretty good. And then, of course, the same if we look at it from the starboard side. It's pretty good. We'll take a better look at that shortly, but again, you can just generally see the overall disposition of everything. And again, it looks good. Everything looks really good, and it's just very solidly constructed with good detail where you'd expect it. Very good job here, NG. And from the port side, just for the sake of continuity, really no details here are different in terms of what we saw already from the starboard side. We just don't have any cargo doors here in the lower half of the fuselage on the port side. But again, you can see our nose and cockpit area looks good. Landing gear detail looks good, as do our L1 through L4 doors. Registration there. And then moving toward our empennage there and tail cone. Looks good. I like our engine nacelles visible there. Everything is just prim and proper and the way it should look in the locations it should be. Looks real nice, and really no complaints whatsoever about this thing. The only other detail that I want to see if we can spot, there we go. See in the midships toward aft section of the aircraft, you can see we have got that belly antenna visible. From our vantage point, it is just below the silver section of the outboard engine closest to frame, right there. So there you go. That belly antenna also rendered and also visible. Looks real good. Again, no qualms about this whatsoever. Brilliant job. Just taking the camera up freehand here to close this out. Perhaps we'll get a little bit of a closer view of some of the things that weren't quite as evident from a slight distance. But there's our nose and cockpit area. You can see the cockpit windows and then our cabin windows there running across the bottom and more so the upper deck areas as well. Additionally, you can see these minuscule air data sensors, angle of attack, and pitot arrays there toward the side of the nose underneath the lower deck of cabin windows there in the nose section. That looks all good. Cockpit windows there. You can see our de-ice misters as well as our windscreen wipers visible, as well as the cockpit windows themselves. Additionally, you've got your emergency egress hatch at the top there, just behind where the cockpit door would be, as well as a boarding door, believe it or not, on the upper deck. The upper deck windows visible. And then, of course, moving up toward topside, you can see that we have a red strobe painted. That looks all good. And we also have these little details on top there. I'm not entirely sure what they are, but undoubtedly some sort of antenna or sensor arrays. We do have a proper 3D antenna there. And then toward the trailing edge of the hub section on the aircraft, that all looks good. Wing roots and then our wings themselves. You can see that we have got our shut lines for our control surfaces, our spoilers, and our single element flaps on the trailing edge, and our leading edge slats as well. Engine nacelles looking good, as well as the pylons to which the nacelles and therefore engines are mounted. And on the near side port wing, same thing. Nice reflection there in the paint. And then, of course, you've got your shut lines for your control surfaces on the trailing edge of the wing. Here's your wing tip with our little probe coming off of the wing tip. That silver area on the leading edge of the wing looks good. And then our engine nacelles. I do like the fan blade details there on the engines. Looks good there. Our inboard port engine and our outboard port engine. Both of them looking absolutely marvelous. No distortions in there. Everything's good, real good. No problems there. Empennage area, very big vertical stabilizer, and then our horizontal stabilizers there with our trim areas there. Looking good. There's our L4 door, registration, and moving back forward. All looking well and good. I like all of that. Lots of nice little graphical details on the aircraft, and NG rendering all of this very, very nicely for all of us. Again, nothing really to fault anywhere on this model. And I did just want to take a closer look at the tail cone area with our auxiliary power unit exhaust. Looks good. You can see that is rendered as a separate element, 3D element in the detailing of the model. It's not just printed on. Looks good. There's our trailing edge of the vertical stabilizer. Looks good. Both sides of the livery intersect perfectly. Looking very nice there. And then our horizontal stabilizer detail along the trailing edge. Looking good. Shut lines visible for our elevator control surfaces. Looks good. You can see trim tab detail there as well. Looks good. Looks real good. Trailing edge of the wings from top side. Better view of the shut lines for our control surfaces. Absolutely wonderful. Very nice. And also you can see just generally the changed shape of the main wing on the SP versus the standard 747. Wings are a bit shorter, and they're swept back a little bit more than they are on the standard 747-100. So, again, more design changes and slight concessions that had to be made for the smaller form factor of this aircraft, but it worked really well. Unfortunately, the SP was not the best-selling version of the 747, but just as good as all the other variants thereof, in my opinion. And again, NG doing a great job to bring this model to us, one of the very few 747 SPs that does remain flying today in 2020. So there it was, in 1/400th scale by NG, the Boeing 747 SP. This model, a new release by NG, obviously a new acquisition for me within the last month. It's absolutely wonderful. Since I got into this hobby, and really not all that long ago, December 2019 is when I started collecting these 1/400 scale aircraft, I wanted an SP because it's just one of those slightly strange, but still very cool civil jets. And of course, since my collection is mostly civil jets, I absolutely wanted a representative of the 747 SP just because of how offbeat it is. The proportions of it, it looks really strange. Obviously, we're all accustomed to seeing the 747 in some variant of its full-size version, and of course, as we get into the Dash 400 and the Dash 8, the 747 has only gotten bigger as time goes on. But the SP bucks that trend entirely. It's the smallest 747 that was ever produced, but to the point that it was produced, it was the longest range variant of the 747, and therefore it became probably more capable than any of its stablemates in terms of not passenger capacity, of course, but in terms of overall range and in terms of overall versatility. This aircraft saw service with the major airlines of the day. To this day, it still sees service with the governments of many countries around the world, including NASA, where it serves as an airborne stratospheric observatory. So, really, the 747 SP, despite only having 45 of them being produced between 1975 and 1989, it really does have a place in aviation history, not for being the first of any kind, but for being probably the best 747 if we're talking about the number of missions that it could be suited for. It can be a civil jet, airliner of course. It can be configured as we see it here for VIP transport. It can be configured for cargo, if need be. It could be configured for science, as in the case of the Sophia aircraft that NASA still operates today. So, really, whatever the mission requires, the SP is able to do it. Not too many of these remain flying today, and again, their service is now confined either to government operators or to private operators, as we see here in this one decked out in the Las Vegas Sands Corporation's livery. But, be that as it may, the 747 SP, despite mostly being a museum piece now, still holds a place in my heart, and I'm sure in the hearts of many other aviation enthusiasts around the world. NG, of course, doing a fantastic job with this model. Everything on it is absolutely wonderful. I can't really find any faults with it worth mentioning. Absolutely. It is a wonderful addition to any 1/400 scale civil jet collection. If you're interested in this one, it is still available. Do put your orders in, though, because I think this one is going to be a hot seller. Until next time, though, I do hope that you have all enjoyed this one. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.